Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Today we're going to build a shaker bookcase. The inspiration came from a piece that we found that was built by a shaker in the late 1800s, and it had characteristics that we don't normally associate with shaker. It had some decorative elements. It was in the library of the still active shaker community at Sabbathday Lake, Maine. We'll go there next, take a look at the antique, come back here, gather up a bunch of cherry, and build our own version. That's next, right here on the New Yankee Workshop.
The New Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Today we're at the Sabbathday Lake Shaker community, 25 miles north of Portland, Maine. It's the last active shaker community in the country, and we're here to see a very special piece of furniture. The piece that we're looking for is in this wonderful old building. This building was constructed in 1880 as a one-room schoolhouse. Today it's a library, and it houses the second largest collection of shaker manuscripts, photographs, all kinds of information, and the public is encouraged to come here and use this facility. Now, when we think of shaker furniture, we think of pieces such as this cabinet. Very simple, made out of pine, flat panel door with a small wooden knob. During some of my research, I came across this book, The Shaker Legacy. And when I was going through it, I came across this piece, which I was immediately drawn to because it had elements that we don't normally see in early shaker furniture. And it lives right over here. It's a great piece. Now, what it starts to show us is some signs of the Victorian era. It was built in 1882. So we see a built-up cornice, a chamfer with little lamb's tongue, and something I had never seen in a shaker piece before, this arched glass door. It's made out of butternut, and it has walnut applied moldings on these flat panels, something else that I hadn't seen. And inside, look at this, a bank of 8 drawers. Now, we know quite a bit about this piece. In fact, we know who built it. Over here, there's some photographs of Elder Henry Green, who made that piece. Here he is as a young man. And he lived in the Alfred shaker community, which is about 40 miles west of here. This was the residence house. And he's in an automobile. He happened to be the mechanic for the community. He took care of all those mechanical needs. Here he is in the garden. And here is a very old man with a cat. In fact, he lived to the ripe old age of 87 years old. So I think that his piece of furniture should become part of our collection. So I'll take a few measurements, some photographs, and think about what kind of wood can we build ours with. Well, here it is, our version of Elder Henry Green's shaker bookcase. We did make some changes. I built ours out of cherry. He used butternut and walnut. Butternut's hard to find these days. And I downsized it a bit. The antique was 7'3" tall. I've made ours 6'6". The base was 42 inches wide. I've cut it to 36. Made it a little shallower, and also decided to move the upper case in a little bit more. It seems to make the piece more graceful. I kept a lot of the details, however. This cornice is very similar. The corners get chamfered with this lamb's tongue carved at the ends. We have flat panels on the sides and on the doors with applied moldings. So if you'd like to build your own shaker bookcase, a measure drawing will be available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now, this project is made up of a lot of panels, frames with inserts. There's one on each end of the top. There's one on each end of the base, and the doors are made in the same manner. So over here, I've ripped and jointed all my stock to the correct width. And I'm going to join the pieces with a mortise and tenon joint. We've got a groove in all the pieces and a tenon on the rails. I want to start forming the groove first. Let's review the setup for making those grooves. I have the stacked dado at 1/4 inch width, set at 1/2 inch high. I've adjusted the fence to where I want it, and I've installed this feather board to keep the stock tightly against the fence as I run it through. I'll run the piece through once, turn it around, run it through again. That ensures that the groove is centered. Now, before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Here I'm running tenons, and I've changed the setup. The stack dado is now wider. I've installed this sacrificial fence so that the dado can go under it just a bit. And by making 2 passes, I can get just the right thickness tenon. Well, let's take another look at our prototype. All the panels, including the doors, have 3/8-inch thick panels like this, a veneer on both sides. I need to rabbet it so that it's a 1/4 inch to fit into those grooves. I like to do the ends of these panels first. The narrow end requires that I use the miter gauge to move the stock through. However, when I get to the length, I'll just run it against the fence. Well, finally, we're ready for some assembly. Before I put any glue on, however, I make sure that I dry fit each panel to make sure the joints are nice and square and that everything fits properly. Once that's done, I start to apply glue. And on these panels that have 2 flat inserts, I like to glue the center stile in first. All right, now I've made some pencil marks to get that centered. Now for the panels, and they go in dry. No glue here. Okay, that's 1 panel, 5 more to go. Here I'm beginning to assemble a dust frame made out of plywood with grooves and tenons made just like I did with those cherry panels. Now let me show you where that goes. Open up the doors of the base cabinet, and that goes up at the top edge of the cabinet. It holds the sides together, and it gives me something that I can use to attach the top. Now, since this is not going to be seen, I'll pin it with some brads. Then I can remove it from the clamps. Another refinement that we made in the Shaker bookcase is that we built ours in 2 parts. There's a base unit down here, and then an upper unit which is attached with some screws. It makes it easier to move the piece around. The top for the base unit is made up of a piece of plywood that's wrapped in some solid cherry. So here are all the parts, and I'll simply miter those front corners. So I use the miter box, set at 45. Here I'm cutting some slots for number 20 biscuits. I'll cut corresponding slots in the solid cherry, and glue will hold it on. No nails. Now, before I put any pressure on the clamps, I want to make sure the fit is perfect. I'm not going to be able to move it once it's clamped. Let's take another look at the prototype. The base cabinet is held together with the lower shelf, the intermediate shelf, and that dust frame I made earlier. All 3 of those sit in dados. We're going to make those next. Once again, I'm using my stacked dado, set up to match the thickness of the plywood shelves and the dust frame. The upper cabinet has 3 adjustable shelves. What holds the sides of the cabinet together are this bottom shelf and one way up at the top. And those sit in rabbets, which we'll make next. Now I've narrowed up the setting of the dado and raised it to cut deeper to give me a 3/8 by 3/8 rabbet for the plywood back on both cabinets. At this point, I'm ready to glue and brad the dust frame and the fixed shelves in place. The back of the base cabinet is a piece of 1/4 inch Luan. No sense wasting money on cherry down here. No one's going to see it. Now I'm ready to start constructing the upper carcass. Once again, glue and nails will hold it together. Now for the back of the upper case, I do want to use cherry plywood because you're going to see it. So we'll set that in a bed of glue and nail it off. And now I'm going to take some solid cherry pieces and cover the plywood edges. You'll note that this piece of cherry that goes on the bottom shelf is proud of the side of the case, and that's to make up for the doors, which sit just above it. All right, I've just notched another piece of solid cherry, and that sits up on top of the dust frame and comes out 13/16 at the top edge so the door can close under it. Well, now I'm back to work on the top. I sanded the solid cherry even with the cherry veneer plywood, and now I'm running this bullnose detail on the edges that are going to show. Before I leave tonight or break down this machine, I'm going to run the same edge on the adjustable shelves for the upper cabinet. Well, good morning. I got started today making a cove in a piece of stock that's about 4.5 inches wide, and that's going to become the base for the lower cabinet. And while I have the router set up, I'm also running another piece to make this scotia to go right under the top. To reinforce that miter joint, I'm cutting slots for biscuits. So with a little glue in those slots and on the biscuits and the miter, I'll join the pieces together, nail it with some brads, and clamp it in place. Well, you'll notice that I'm taking the time to install some glue blocks. This piece is going to take a lot of stress. Some precautions now will avoid problems later. Now with the case flipped over onto its top, I'm installing this small scotia molding right under the edge. A little glue and brads. No biscuits here. The upper doors on our cabinet are hinged onto a face frame. There are two stiles and a rail. Elder Green put a little bead detail on his antique. We're going to do the same. Now I used a router bit to make that bead, and it looks like this one, except it's a 1/8 inch diameter. Now here's the tricky part. I have to remove the bead where it meets the rail and miter it. I'll show you how that's done. I've tipped the saw to 45 degrees and put a layout mark, and the height of the blade is set so that I cut only the bead. To remove the bead above the miter, I'm using my joiner. I could do this with a table saw, but since I have the joiner, this does a really nice job. I'll remove the rest with a chisel. Now for the rail, I have to just miter the bead. To join that rail to the stiles, I'm going to use pocket screw technology. You've seen us use that before. This is the simplest of all the jigs, and it guides the drill at the correct angle. Okay, now that's the pilot hole for the screw, and there's the pocket for the head of the screw. Okay, I'm going to add a little glue. And I like to clamp them so that they're even on the face, nice and even. And then I simply drive these special screws that have a wide head to give it strength. Boy, that really pulls it together. I'm going to join the face frame to the cabinet with biscuits and glue. I want to cut the slots a 1/2 inch in from this face because I don't want them to interfere with this chamfer. With glue in the biscuit slots and a bead of glue along the stiles, I'm ready to drop the assembly onto the case, get it lined up, and clamp it. Well, now it's time to make the doors for the upper case. There's a rabbet on the inside to receive the glass and a bead on the outside. We'll use our door making set to create these joints between the rails and stiles. The first thing that I want to do is cope the ends of the stiles. Now I've switched to the corresponding bit, and that makes the rabbet as well as this bead. It's often called the stick. Now those copes that I cut earlier, they fit in just like that. Now for the top rail, I need to lay out the arch, and I want to be just inside that bead a little bit. We'll cut it out on the bandsaw. Okay, now we're ready to glue it up. And this is a very fragile bit of wood here, so I want to make sure I get good coverage on the glue, slip the pieces in, and clamp them very carefully. I don't want to break it now. While the door is set in the clamps for a while, I want to deal with this chamfer and lamb's tongue detail. I made a little template to lay out the lamb's tongue at each end point. But the first thing I'm going to do is chamfer the edge with my router, staying clear of that lamb's tongue. Now, using a sharp chisel, I'll just slowly part away until I get it exactly the way I want it, and then sand it a bit. Well, now it's time to start working on this cornice molding, and I want to make this bead detail on the first two pieces. I'll do that at the router station. I just used a 3/8 inch radius bead bit. All right, now there's the first wrap for the cornice with that beaded material. Just gets glued and nailed in place. Now the second wrap is the same bead detail, just a slightly smaller piece. The next piece of our cornice is 3/8 of an inch thick, and I've rounded the front edge with a 3/8 inch diameter. This piece of plywood is cut at a 42-degree bevel, and that's going to support the crown molding. For the last piece of molding, we got lucky. My hardwood supplier sells a cherry cornice molding. Now, I don't want this cove, so I'm ripping that off at a 42-degree bevel. All right, now that cornice fits right in against the plywood, and I'm going to actually nail it from the back side here. Just a couple tacks to hold it while the glue sets. The last piece that goes on the cornice is this piece of plywood that's also cut at 42 degrees. And it adds a lot of support to this edge of the molding. Well, that looks pretty good. We'll finish it up in the morning. Well, good morning. We're off to a good start today. I'm now installing the panel moldings that go around all of the flat panels. Let me show you how I made it. To make that molding, I'm starting out with some 3/8 inch stock, a fairly wide piece so I can make a molding on each edge. And since the bit is buried, I want to break out my catalog and show you what I'm using. It's actually part of a door maker's set. It's the OG profile, and I'm just using the bit, this portion of the bit, to get that shape. Some 3/4 inch pins hold the molding in place. Now it's time to finish the glass panel door. The glue has dried, I've sanded everything smooth, and I want to continue this 1/4 inch radius around the arch. And to do that, I'm simply going to use a 1/4 inch radius bit. With the door flipped over, I'm going to complete the rabbet to receive the glass. The rabbet on the antique followed the curve, and they held the glass in with glazing compound. I want to hold it in with little wooden cleats. So I'm creating a geometric form that has straight edges. I'll remove the material with this pattern-making bit that has a bearing which will ride against my template. Here are the hinges that I'm going to use to hang the doors. I've made a template to route out the mortise. I'll use the router with a collar and a mortising bit. That's good. All right. Now it's time to make some shelf supports. So over here at the table saw, I've ganged together 4 pieces of wood. They're a 1/2 inch wide, 1 1/4 inch high, and I've laid out for some notches. You've seen me use this system before. I'll make the square cut first. Okay, now these standards get screwed to the inside of the cabinet, one at the front, one at the back, and then I make these little supports which sit in those slots. Now I don't want to attach these yet. We want to take this piece to the finishing room first. Now cherry can be tough to finish, so we're taking some techniques from our friend Michael Crow at Leonard's Antiques to get a nice even finish. And what he likes to do is start with a amber stain, and that just gets wiped on. Here on one of the shelves, let me show you the next step. I'm just taking a sealer and wiping it on, just a nice, even, thin coat. Now that the sealer has dried, I can knock it down with some 3/0 steel wool. The next step is to glaze the piece, and what we're using is a brown mahogany, and it's really a pigment in a dispersion oil. So I just put it on. I don't want to let it dry. Put it on fairly quickly in a circle if I want, like this. And then when I get the whole thing covered, I'm going to wipe off the excess with a clean rag. Okay, now with a fresh rag, wipe it along the grain so it's nice and even, and let it dry overnight. Well, after that glaze thoroughly dried, I knocked it down with some 4/0 steel wool, and now I'm starting the protective coats. A satin wipe-on poly. Several coats with a light sanding between should do the job, and you can see how it's really bringing out the grain of that cherry. All right, well there it is with several coats of polyurethane. I've installed the glass panels, the adjustable shelves, and secured the upper case to the lower with a couple screws. I hope the Shakers at Sabbathday Lake will approve of this piece. We'll send them a copy of the program. Now let me show you what we've been working on for next time. We call it a tall case oak clock. We've been meaning to build one of these for quite some time. It has an arts and crafts look and a full 8-day movement with a pendulum, weights, and it even has chimes. We'll tell you all about it next time right here in the New Yankee Workshop.
If you enjoyed this New Yankee project, please visit our website at newyankee.com for a complete online catalog of all the other projects you've seen Norm build here in the New Yankee Workshop.